Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Sweet. Yeah, like she said, thank you for the introduction. My name's Jacob. I'm an MPhil student here. So I've been here for about a month and a half now, and I'm actually going to be presenting on research that hasn't happened yet, but I'm planning to do while I'm here at Cambridge. So excuse the basic kind of sort of aspect of this presentation. But I'm super excited to talk to you guys today about using plant physiology to understand how changing fire regimes may alter carbon sequestration. And this is important because of feedbacks on climate change. Okay, so first of all, what is plant physiology and why do you care? Why should you care? So just like, I can move around with my muscles and I'm breathing with my diaphragm and lungs, those are physiological aspects of my human body. And plants are the same way. So plant physiology is the study of how plants function. Plants breathe, they eat, they drink, they stand up tall, they acquire nutrients and food, and so they have specialized structures to do this. And so they breathe through little holes in their leaf called stomata. They exchange carbon dioxide with the air and assimilate CO2 via chloroplasts, which is the green stuff that you're seeing. And that's how they eat. They drink via vascular systems. Xylem and phloem are what they're called, but it doesn't really matter. They're basically tubes that transport water up and down the leaves, down the plant. And then they also acquire nutrients via a very complex interaction with the minerals and biological material that is inside the soil that you pick up, and it's all very dirty. But the roots are very, very important. And one thing that I want to stress today is that every plant is specially adapted to its own environment. So think about a desert with spiky, very succulent cacti. The cacti are very spread out because they need lots of deep roots to spread out and gather as much water as possible, versus a very lush tropical rainforest that have very fast photosynthetic rates. They take up water very quickly. And so these two environments promote certain plants that have certain physiological adaptations. But it's not a one-way street. Plants also interact with their environment and change their environment. So tropical rainforests, the plants are taking up so much water and then transpiring it out through their stomata, breathing out water, that they're actually increasing the water vapor in the atmosphere and promoting rainfall. And so these adaptations actually affect the climate and affect the environments that we are interacting with on a daily basis. And so I want to go just quickly into what are feedback loops, and the biogeosphere. So consider really quickly Amazon rainforest die-off. It's one of the most important things that's happening right now. And it's contributing to temperature rise via this positive feedback loop. So we have added CO2 into the atmosphere, temperatures rise, and drought and wildfires are increasing in abundance and occurrence in the Amazon rainforest. And so more trees are dying, they're decomposing, being burned, and that's releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere. And so there's fewer trees, which means there's less water being pumped into the atmosphere, which means less rainfall, more drought, higher temperatures, and so this is what I mean when I say positive feedback loop. And what's really interesting to me, and what I will be studying here at Cambridge, is the underground portion of this. So you think about plants, they're very tall and beautiful, but you don't really tend to think about the underground portion of what plants are doing. And so these roots are actually having very complex interactions with the mineral soil, and everything that's happening underground is very poorly understood because of how complex it is and because of how hard it is to study. And they also have very interesting interactions with mycorrhizal fungi, where they're actually exchanging the CO2 that they're assimilating for micronutrients that the mycorrhizal fungi are very good at taking up. And this can have effects on carbon sequestration via the decomposition of roots, and as well as the uptake of carbon via the plants and storage of carbon in the roots. And this contributes to the overall carbon budget of the planet. And so it's very important. So I want to talk really quickly about what we do know. So anthropogenic climate change will change fire regimes. So a fire regime is basically the frequency of fires in an ecosystem and the intensity of those fires, as well as the seasonality of those fires. And so we know that hotter and drier conditions promote increased fire frequency. And this is because there are longer growing seasons, and so plants are able to take up a bunch of carbon, but then as the end of the growing season approaches, these plants are drying out, they're dying, and that's their natural cycle, but there's more dry fuel to be burned at the end of the growing season. So you get more frequent fires and more intense fires. There's also humans that are causing sparks and igniting fires. What else we do know is that these changing fire regimes will also change the plant communities that inhabit these ecosystems. So if you think about the adaptations that I was talking about earlier, the physiology of these plants, they're all highly adapted to their own environment. And so each environment has a certain community composition, as we say, of plants that you're likely to find there. And so when you burn an ecosystem, the current vegetation is cleared, which increases the light, and that promotes certain plants that are susceptible to or very good at uptaking light very quickly. But you're also, because of the high temperature of these fires, you're volatilizing the nutrients in the soil, and the soil becomes nutrient depleted, and so the roots have to be very specially adapted to that environment as well. And so every time a fire comes through an ecosystem, a whole new type of plant community arises, and these plants are specially adapted. And those physiological changes will have potential impacts on carbon sequestration in these ecosystems. And so when you think about roots, there's kind of a trade-off between acquisitive and conservative root strategies, where acquisitive strategies, that you can see on the left, are very fast return on investment for carbon. So you want to have a small diameter, which promotes a high surface area to volume ratio, and you want low density, so low carbon input into each unit of length of root. And you also want a very high nitrogen content, so that you can have high metabolism, and then many mycorrhizal associations. So this would be a characteristic acquisitive root strategy. And this would be a conservative root strategy where there's a large diameter, basically the exact opposite of acquisitive, but you have a slow return on investment on carbon, and you're slow growing, you last for a very long time, and so they're very carbon dense. They have a low nitrogen content, which is associated with low metabolic rates and fewer mycorrhizal associations. So what we don't know is, because of how complex fires are, and fire regimes are always changing and always affecting these ecosystems, so what we don't know is will there be a directional effect on the physiology of the plants that are inhabiting these ecosystems. And then additionally, how will these physiological changes that occur in the plant communities affect carbon and nutrient cycling in these ecosystems? So for my MPhil, I plan to measure fine root traits in a common garden here at the Cambridge Botanic Garden and relate those to fire responses across 70 different species from fire data, fire manipulation plot data that has already been gathered previously. And this will inform plant adaptations to fire and hopefully carbon cycling as well. So I mentioned it's very complex, and fire is affecting many different aspects of the environment all at once. And so there are competing hypotheses as to what my data might look like. But since fires deplete soil nutrients, you might be expecting more conservative traits to be favored. And those conservative traits, because they're slow growing, will slow carbon cycling and slow carbon sequestration, which could have a positive feedback loop, feedback on climate change. And that could be potentially disastrous. Or, since fires increase light availability, more acquisitive traits could be favored, which would increase carbon cycling and lead to more carbon sequestration, which would have a negative feedback loop or a stabilizing effect on the climate. And so these are very important questions that need to be answered. And so I'm very excited to work on this. So in conclusion, climate change will intensify fire regimes, making them more frequent and more intense. And these regimes will favor different plant communities. Those communities will have different physiologies, and that could potentially have feedback on climate change. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much. I'm looking for the questions. Oh, coming.
Thank you. So in the Australian, plants and trees are known for fires actually being a good thing, and they actually allow fertilization and they allow them to grow, and so that's kind of a natural way of life is fires in bush. Mm-hmm. Do you think we're going to get closer to that, where we see more forests where they actually rely on fires to kind of carry on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that that's definitely the case. I think, Australia has been riddled by fires. They have a very seasonally dry environment. So when it's during the wet season, these plants are growing really quickly, and then during the dry season, they dry out, and there's lots of fuel around. But those plants are also specially adapted to those fire regimes, as you said. So I think you'll see a certain community of plants over time through climate change that's more specially adapted to fire. And as I try to highlight here, that could have consequences for feedbacks on carbon cycling and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question.
Do you burn your plants?
Unfortunately, I'm not the one who gets to burn the plants. The plants have already been burned. Yeah, unfortunately.
Oh, not the fun part. Any other questions? I'm looking around. And the time as well. We have 1 more minute for questions, if you want. Yes, please. Yes, a moment, I'm there.
So if I could be stupid enough and ask exactly what carbon sequestration means, could you explain that exactly?
Carbon sequestration is it's basically the assimilation of CO2 from the atmosphere, and then the locking of that carbon into the soil or the actual plant material. So carbon is not sequestered if that tree or plant is then burned and the CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. It has to be kind of locked in the soil for a long period of time to be considered carbon sequestration.
Right, okay, which is what we want, right? We want the plants to...
Yeah, so we are adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and we want the plants to do the dirty work for us by taking the CO2 back into the soil and stabilizing our climate.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you very much, and with that, the time is up. So